Recording and
So everyone's voice can be. Oh, that's yours. No, I was just.
Yep. All right. Can't go. All right. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second. Huh? Yeah, I know, but I think that can hear me because otherwise we'll do the. Where's the microphone? All right. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully they can hear me from here. Otherwise, we'll have the echo and feedback. Yeah, I'm using this for my audio. Don't worry. Is there anyone online? Okay, we'll ask. Can you ask them if they can hear me? Folks online, can you hear us? Q&A. Oh, Carly. Oh, excellent. Thank you, Carly. Yes, they can hear us. Very good. Excellent. Thank you. All right. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second session of Streets and Streeters New Horizons in African Urban Space Epistemologies panel that was created. This is the brainchild of our colleague here, Bankole Wright. So my name is Ademide Adelusi Adelui. I will be the chair for this second session. Thank you for joining us and for those who are coming from the first session. And also welcome to everyone online. We have only 3 panelists today, so if you're here to also hear Tolulope, he will not be able to join us this morning, so it'll be the 3 of us here. So Bankole will tell us a little bit about what the concept for these panels are, and then we'll begin.
Hi, everyone. So basically, while I was thinking about this panel, I was just interested in how we can understand the streets and its and those who derive their identity from the streets in multifaceted ways, right? I was quite uncomfortable about these limitations of thinking about the street as a physical space alone, right? And as from the perspective of architectural and infrastructural standpoint, basically. And I was basically just saying that the street does more than that, and the street is more than that, right? And I was basically thinking about the street as embodied spaces, as spaces for both physical, both metaphorical, symbolic, and also embodied perspective, and how the street can also help us to understand dimensions of class, right? Dimensions of race, dimensions of gender, and other forms of social markers. So basically, this was my thoughts, or these are the things that I was basically thinking about when putting up this abstract. And interestingly, we've had 2 panels. Like we had 1 last year, we had 2 this year. So I guess we are growing, right? So welcome once again, and please, we are open to your questions, your ideas, your thoughts. Engage us, right? Because the idea is to build this. The idea is to ensure that this panel grows into something larger, like books and other forms of intellectual and knowledge production systems. So basically, I would just say that we are here to rebuild, rethink, and recreate epistemologies of the streets. And we need your input to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Bankole. So just some ground rules for our panel. So we will probably each speak about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll take questions at the end. I will introduce every speaker, including myself. And we just ask that please, as he said, please engage with us in our work. A lot of us are working through new ideas, but we also ask that if you have a call, if you have a cell phone, if you please silence it or take your call outside. And if you have a question or a comment at the end, keep it brief so that everybody can participate with us. But thank you for coming. So I guess I'll keep talking. As I said, I'm Ademide. I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of California, Riverside. I'm a historian and I work on mid-19th century Lagos, specifically thinking about the city from the 1840s to the early 1870s. So I'm really interested in, so my presentation is called In These Streets, Rethinking History with the City as an Archive, and thinking about how we can use Lagos Island itself and its streets and street names as an archive of the past, rather than always proceeding from thinking about starting the history of Lagos or other places in Africa from outside the space. So I'll time myself. Time, excuse me. All right, and I'm sorry you can't see it so clearly, but basically the graphic that I am presenting here is, so I'm also a map maker. I'm really interested in digital humanities and really thinking about remapping and understanding Lagos through space and maps and understanding how people use the city. So if you could see the graphic, I don't know if I can zoom in. Basically, what it is, it's a graphic about Old Lagos with a map of Old Lagos underneath. And each of these are street signs from Lagos Island now. And the colors represent the different indigenous quarters that are there. So it's kind of, so this chapter from my book will give you a kind of tour of Lagos based on the streets themselves as a network for history. So I'll begin. So today I'm going to be talking about my research on the histories of 19th century Lagos by looking at the ways we can think about streets and street names as a pathway to history by combining them with analyzing oral narratives, the traditional archives that we find in different countries in the world, and historical maps. Reading all of these things together with the actual urban fabric of Lagos, and of course thinking about Yoruba sources as well as a kind of ensemble for thinking about the past. One of the main questions I have for thinking about streets and Lagos and history is, what traces do people leave in the places where they live, thrive, and even where they die? What are the echoes of people's lives from even 150 years ago in this city? My talk is about the spatial history of 19th century Lagos, and I rebuild the city's history as a series of encounters in the streets between men and women, between the past and the present, between enslaved people and free people, between people who are living and people who are dead, as they all circulate in the streets of Lagos between 1845 and 1872. So my presentation spans the period of Old Lagos, which is the city as it evolved in the time period of 1845 to 1872. So I'm not particularly interested in focusing on elite figures. They've already occupied a lot of space in the historiography, but I'm really interested in everyday ordinary Lagosians, the Araiko, the people who inhabit space in the city and make Lagos and continue to make Lagos what it is. So this is not a history of chiefs or Obas or even British imperial rule only. What I want to know is, what do the names of streets in Lagos Island tell us about the past and the people and place? What I argue in my work is that there is a history embedded in the streets and street names of Lagos Island, if we know how to read them. These street names point to narratives of loss, the pains of enslavement, the prominence of new religions, i.e. Islam and Christianity, while pointing also to the tenacity of indigenous religious worship, i.e. because Orisha themselves are in the names of our streets in Lagos. And also we see in the streets names traumas of slavery, both domestic and transatlantic, and the possibilities about understanding gender relations and other kinds of religious worship that even predate British colonialism. All of this information emerges from the names of streets in Lagos. So as I said, I use a lot of maps. I'm sorry you can't see it so clearly. Now, before the 1870s, there was no publicly recorded list of streets, squares, or compound names in use in Lagos. So one of the things I ask myself is, how did Lagosians navigate their way around the city? How did they go from Ologo to Isaleko, things like that? How did people know where to go around? Of course, in Lagos, we know how we get directions now, right? We're not necessarily using street names. So what I want to know is, how did people get around and know their city? Until the 1850s, the ways that space was marked was not legible to the visitors, who are the ones that compiled the sources that we use traditionally, the letters, the sketches, the maps of the towns. There is no visible system of identification. Yet we know from being in Lagos that all these sites in Lagos, from Ekpetedo to Ologbo to Itolo to Ofin, all of these places held special significance for the people who lived, worked, escaped, or even were enslaved in this city. The significance of these spaces, I argue, is actually archived in the street names of Lagos. So I'll come back to this slide. But in 1868, an English-speaking Yoruba clerk, Otumba Payne, named all the streets, all the newly paved streets and old streets also in the city of Lagos in the wake of the new colonial infrastructure that was quickly taking root. Now, rather than superimposing British names or even a stripped down numbering system or scheme that we might expect, First Street, Second Street, whatever it is, he actually used mostly indigenous and Yoruba names. And the names that he used reflect a remarkable archive of local priorities, symbols, events, places, and people. These names highlighted the spaces that were already in use. We know about Isala Eko, the old city center. We find names of enslaved people, we find names of women, we find names of Orisha. And I think I'm going to try to zoom in so you can see. This is from his almanac. So he actually kept, so when you look at the historical archive, you can actually see many of the streets that were there, from Bamboshe Street to Tokumbo Street, Lake Street, Okelobo, all of these street names. We find them from when he named them in 1868. So, excuse me. What I argue is that almost every historical episode in Lagos is linked and embedded in this, at least up until the 1870s, is linked and embedded in the history of these street names. These streets are a remarkable archive of our history. Many colonial cities in West Africa have naming schemes that inscribe the ambition and scope of colonial power. But in Lagos, what we have is street names that provide a unique opportunity to access an indigenous past that is usually characterized by archival silences, exploitation, or violence. Streets in Lagos for us should be a site of historical concern. However, my research shows that the city's history is embedded in the present and is actually visible in the historical core of Lagos Island till today, if we know how to look at it and how to read these spaces. And I'll show you part of what I've been doing with this work. Lagos, as we know it today, is a wounded city. It is hurt by scars from war, from bombardments, from political competition, and even the so-called banality of progress. We destroy our history often to sort of in service of what we think of as progressive ideas, or maybe not progressive, but modern ideas, I should say. The people and place of Lagos have been shaped by these encounters, and these layered histories of Lagos are visible in the city streets if you know where to look and how to read them, at places that used to be markets, homes, squares, cemeteries, shrines, barracoons, and even prisons in Lagos Island. But for those of us who are interested in Lagos, and I'll check the time, excuse me, there are many challenges. Oral narratives are available, but they're not as plentiful as the colonial archive that maps and places the city. In the 19th century, we also see a wave of formerly enslaved people who return to Lagos from Havana, from Bahia, and even from the US, who bring with them new styles of architecture. We also have massive inflows of people coming from around Yoruba land and the coast. So Lagos's urban fabric, for instance, seen in this map from 1891, is as uneven as any old city that is a meeting point for different regimes of power. Nowadays, the city's fabric is a typical post-colonial urban palimpsest with clues to its historical contours, places, and sites peeking out. A city's sudden turn or curious dead end makes sense when you read through the shapes of places that have disappeared from the streets. The curves of the streets follow the former boundaries of lagoons, old neighborhoods, old squares in places like Ofin and Iriko, and in areas of Western Lagos where we suffered from the sort of rhetoric and violence of, quote, slum clearance practices that hollowed out historical quarters in the past. All over Lagos, we can see how striking it is that the 20th century, excuse me, I'm the one. All over Lagos, if you know how to look at the maps, you know how to look at the roads. I've been able to carve out the shape of old Lagos by looking at the historical maps and the historical evidence that we have. So I believe that that's Adeniji Road, that's the edge. That used to be the former boundary in the north of Lagos. And if you look around, you'll see to the left, you see a creek, another swamp, You see the old perimeter of the marina, it goes around and you see large swamps. I'm sorry if you can't see it so clearly, but this is what I mean. So when you think about places that have been hollowed out, this used to be Jumago Lagoon and Isalegogo Lagoon right there. So when you think about the kind of flooding that happens in Lagos Island, these are lagoons and other things that have been filled in. And if you go over here in the western portion, this is Elegbata Creek. It used to be a creek. And if you look at the sources from the bombardment, they talk about how in 1851, a creek and a swamp saved the city from being destroyed. So when you're in, next time you're in Lake Street, you know that the way it curves follows the curve of the lake. And Elegbata Street also shows you that there used to be a canal called Elegbata Creek, but it's no longer there. So part of what I do in my own work is how can we make this visible? And so what I'll do is just look at the rest and I'll show you. So whatever GIS, digital humanities, there are ways we can layer historical maps and the contemporary city. So I'll show you the earlier map I showed you. You can actually layer the old maps and compare them and look around. So that's the old Balogun Square you can see in the city. I'm sorry if it's not so clear, but you can actually find old parts of Lagos under the contemporary satellite map. So for instance, if we look at the second section over here, so these are the ways that I combine these maps. You can see Elegbata Creek underneath and Alakoro swamp and creek in the corner. So by doing this work of layering the historical maps and these streets, this is how I've been able to carve out old Lagos and make it visible on the contemporary city. So I guess I'm running out of time, but what I wanted to make sure that I highlight with the rest of my paper is that I'm a historian, so I spend a lot of time in archives and looking at archival sources and also maps and making maps as I've shown you. But after being able to carve out the old shoreline, find the old swamps, find the old creeks, and start thinking about their significance, I realized later in my research and doing my book that you can't spend you shouldn't spend all your time in archives. And coming to Lagos Studies and speaking to people, I realized that I actually had to spend more time walking in Lagos Island and actually going to these places and actually trying to maybe document and find what we could find, which is how I started looking at the street signs and the street names, because I think about 100 or so of them from the 1860s are still in use till today. So this is why I showed you the first slide. We can actually document these street names. So what I do in my work is that I've been able to categorize the streets according to, at least in my perspective, their symbolic value. And if you were able to see these maps, you would see that I draw over them in Yoruba as I'm mapping over the old streets, the old bridges we used to have even. These lines represent bridges that used to exist from the 1860s and 70s, the Ofe Canal, all kinds of infrastructure that tell us cultural stories about Lagos that are now gone. So also, when you look at the patterns that the street names give you, some of them, they tell you about Orisha, they tell you about people. There's even an Orisha I ran into that I'd never heard of before. Maybe, has anyone ever heard of Tijuriku? Tijuriku and Orisha, related to smallpox. Well, there's a Tijuriku street in Lagos Island. What does Tijuriku mean? Tijuriku? Tijuriku? Or shame death. Okay, all right. So it's actually near one of the smallpox shrines. So perhaps it's something related to infant mortality. And I believe Tijuriku Street is actually still there in that sense. So sometimes we see that the old Orisha names are around the lagoons and water bodies and old shrines. Another one we see is, so I try to find the patterns of why are enslaved people's street names, why are the names of people who were formerly enslaved in particular places in Lagos? So anyway, I will conclude very shortly. So my book is called Imagine Lagos, and I talk about all of these kinds of questions in the book. How can we use the city itself as an archive? So each chapter of the book starts at a particular intersection, because I spent a lot of time walking in Lagos and trying to understand what these streets mean and why they come together in particular ways and what they do together. So there was one more thing I was going to say about streets, but sorry, I'm the timekeeper also, so so I want to make sure that I have this. So so when we start to examine street names, then we can start thinking about people who only appear in the archive in very short ways. There are many people who come in and out of the archive and there's no way to tell their story, but because we know where they are, I talk about these people's stories. One particularly effective and like story that affected me a lot in thinking. Growing up in Lagos, we don't really talk about slavery, right? We don't really learn that much about slavery and what it means. But Lagos historically was a transatlantic port where people were enslaved from. And so one of the stories that I found after the bombardment in 1852, there was a Christian missionary who used to walk around Idumota and write every day in his journal about what he saw, who he saw, and how he would try to convince people to abandon Ifa worship and join the Christians. And so one day he met a man who had just come back to Lagos after the bombardment. And the man said, "Can you take me to this chief's house?" And he said, "Why?" And he said, "I want you to take me there because this man was the man that enslaved me." And he talks about how he remembers the house he was enslaved from in Idumota. And I'm sorry the slide is not showing, but I had the journal sheet. He talks about, "You take me to this chief's house. He's the one that enslaved me. I need to confront him because I've been rescued and I'm back." And this happened, well, at least the missionary said it happened. It's a great story. So he takes him to his house and he says, "Little did you think you would ever see me again, but here I am, I'm back." And then the sources continue to talk about how, so these things happen in Lagos streets and so many things are observed. So as Bankole has said, we know when we think seriously about streets and street names, this project came up because when I was working on the history of the tram in Lagos, I found myself at the intersection of Inobere and Omididum. What does Omididum mean? What about Inobere? So why do those streets meet that way? What do we think it means? So this is the puzzle, right? Why is there a street about a fire? No, so nobody has written this down. So I'm working through this. I'm trying to understand the symbolic meaning of these streets. Why are we reading about fires? Why are we reading about loss? Why are these things happening? So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. I died. I've stopped the share. Thank you. All right, we have 20 minutes.
Me?
Yes. Oh, are you? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh my God, I'm sorry. I am the person. Vicky. All right, so let me introduce Dr. Brennan. I thought I was free. I forgot I'm the chair. All right. So next we have Dr. Vicky Brennan, who is an associate professor of religion and the director of global studies at the University of Vermont. Dr. Brennan writes and teaches about questions of sound, materiality, ethics, and religion in Africa and the African diaspora. Her book, Singing Yoruba Christianity, published in 2018 by Indiana University Press, examines how members of the Cherubim and Seraphim Church movement in Lagos, Nigeria, use music, dance, and other material forms as a means of producing moral community and reinforcing ethical values and modes of self-making. Right. Thank you, Dr. Brennan.
Thank you.
20 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Bankole, for organizing this wonderful panel that's allowed me to think through some of my research materials in a really interesting way. So my presentation is titled Listening and Ordinary Ethics in the Streets of Lagos. And in this presentation, I want to speculatively examine the ways that religious sounds contribute to the rhythms of urban life in the streets of Lagos. I hope to trace how the street registers as a material and phenomenological composition, one that is central to emergent practices of religious and secular encounter and sociability. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So following the anthropologist Katie Stewart's exploration of what she calls road registers, I similarly center this discussion on the sounds of the street as a particular form emergent in the conduct of life, which constitutes an intimate register of knowledge and power. So my discussion today draws on materials collected in February and March 2021 by a team of researchers who visited 3 parts of Lagos: Isaleco, Yaba Surulere, and Badagry. And I just want to acknowledge those researchers. Because of COVID, I couldn't travel to lead the research team, so I managed it remotely. Are any of them here? Some of them said they would try to come today, but maybe they couldn't make it. If you're online, thank you very much. And I also want to thank my main collaborator, Harrison Adeniyi of Lagos State University, who helped facilitate the collaboration, the work with the research assistants. So at each site that the research team visited, they listened to the sound of each place, noting when religious sounds were heard and how they contributed to the overall soundscape. The researchers took GPS and noise measurements and they engaged in intensive listening activities, including sound walks and listening in place, which entailed listening intentionally to the sounds around them and writing detailed field notes about the quantity, quality, and context of the sounds they heard and their qualitative experiences of listening. The researchers also made short field recordings to supplement their practices of audition, and I'm going to use a couple of these recordings to sonically illustrate my talk today. So I don't have a PowerPoint, I have sonic examples instead. So my engagement with these field materials is connected to a longer-term ethnographic consideration of the sounds of the city based on my visits to Lagos over the past 20 years. In working through these ideas, I also engaged with a variety of artistic, literary, and research materials that capture some of the experiential sounds of the city. And these include Emeka Ogbo's Lagos Soundscape Project, urban studies research that explores the growth and expansion of the city at micro and macro levels, and literary and film representations of the city. So in what follows, I'm going to draw attention to two moments when religion is made audible in the streets of Lagos, asking what these ordinary engagements might contribute to urban sensibilities and social practices that attune residents towards everyday ethical practices, judgments, and commitments. These moments are both singular and multiple. I focus on discrete examples that are themselves normal, expected, and stereotypical. For the purposes of this discussion, I amplify their presence, lifting specific sounds out of the mix that constitutes the soundtrack of everyday life on the street. At other times, I return the sounds to their messy contexts to show how they are one of the tactics through which Lagosians navigate and encounter the street, producing knowledge and shaping social relationships. So the first moment or scene I want to focus on is about walking and nonverbal sound. So walking in Lagos, as most of you know, most often entails a very purposeful movement through the city, moving from one place to another place rather than exploring the city on foot. In Lagos, one treks from home to work, to the market, to an appointment. Strolling, wandering, meandering may certainly be practices that are engaged in by some, but they are by no means the norm. One walks with intention to the bus stop, to the transit center, to the market or the kiosk, to work or school, carefully threading one's way through pedestrian and vehicular traffic. And so I want to zoom in on an early morning in 2021 on Lagos Island near Ijumota Market. Vendors set up their wares as commuters thread their way towards their destination, coming or going to Eko. The city is waking up, the sky is still a bit dark, and the air is cool. People walk along the sides of the street, some making their way to their workplace, others to a nearby transit hub. If one listens at this moment, one can hear footsteps, clothes rustling, the murmur of voices in quiet conversation, cell phone ringtones, and the rumble of automobile traffic just starting to fill the streets. On this morning in particular, a man dressed in white from head to ankle, walking carefully with his feet bare, is but one part of the flow of foot traffic. His dress indicates his association with the Celestial Church of Christ, an indigenous Yoruba church. As he walks, he rings a long-handled bell held in his left hand, his Bible clenched securely in the crook of his right arm. The sound of the bell dominates the soundscape as he passes. And I'm just going to play that first example. Sorry, I'll play that again. All right. So most pedestrians move past the prophet silently. He is merely part of the flow of footsteps. He too is on his way somewhere, moving from one place in the city to another. One might surmise, given his dress, that he's probably on his way to church for worship, or perhaps to minister to someone in their home, or to deliver a spiritual message to someone in need of counseling. In any case, his appearance marks his religious obligations. And yet his religious affiliation, the purpose of his transit, is not just communicated through his appearance, right? The white garment, the bare feet, the Bible. As he walks along the street, the prophet deliberately and persistently rings the bell, calling audible attention to his movements. Amidst the footsteps, the ringing cell phones, the mundane chatter, he marks his movement audibly. The sound of the bell adds another layer to the sounds of daily life on the street. It also joins similar nonverbal sounds we heard on the streets of Lagos that indicates a person's purpose as they walk. The metallic clink of scissors by Ejikani shop, the tailor who carries the sewing machine on his shoulder, the rattle from the Sobata cobbler who shakes the handles of his toolbox, the tapping sound of a vendor selling snacks from a box on his head, the clank made by the iron condemned Malam as he collects scrap metal. The religiously marked sound of the prophet's bell joins these and other sounds of people who audibly announce their purpose as they move through the city. In doing so, he adds a rhythmic layer to the soundtrack, calling attention to the presence of religion in this space as he moves through it. And I'm really emphasizing movement, right? Maps are great, but to think about the city as a place of flow and movement. So Philip Dubuc has characterized the rhythms and flows of experience in the city of Kinshasa as one of disorder and confusion, one that requires that city dwellers engage in practices of trailblazing as they navigate the sheer turbulence of everyday life. He writes, quote, urban living is ceaselessly rhythmed by its excesses and scarcities, its dispersals and immobilizations, its homogeneity and heterogeneity, its total boundlessness and the totalitarian nature of its endless restrictions, its frequent moments of violent effervescence, and the boredom of endless waiting that also characterize urban life. So following from this, by listening, we might hear how people become part of the shared rhythms of urban space for their own purposes as they hustle to make their lives amidst the uncertainty of the street. In the case of the prophet and his bell, the steady pulse stakes a claims for religion, a small sonic reminder to passersby of Christ amidst the normal everyday patterns of sound and movement. The prophet's bell with its rhythmic pulse is both a recognition of quotidian practice, but also an eruption of it. He doesn't just align his movement with the rhythms of the city, he adds a layer to it. The religious sound is not pushy or didactic, unlike that of an evangelist who uses her voice to appeal to people on the street to pay attention to her religious message. Rather, the prophet's bell merely notes his presence and the religious purpose that underlies his movement as one note among many shaping the morning commute. God, too, is in the street. So the second moment I want to focus on concerns loudspeakers and the voice. So if the prophet's bell adds a sonic layer to the city's rhythmic mix, one that points to the ordinary and everyday presence of religion in the streets, then sounds coming from loudspeakers attached to churches, mosques, and other sites amplify that presence. Unlike the bell that moves with the prophet as he walks along the street, the loudspeaker is fixed, mounted to a building or along the fence surrounding a compound, and encountered by passersby as they walk along the street. The loudspeaker amplifies the sounds heard on the shop floor or in the worship space to the street, broadcasting a call to those outside. These sounds become part of the ambient background sounds of the street, serving as a form of religious publicity that blurs the boundary between public and private, religious and secular. And so now I want to drop in on the street in Surulere on a Friday in late February 2021, moving with the flow of pedestrians, cars, motorcycles, and buses. We hear the sounds of horns, the rumbles of engines, hawkers calling to customers, the busy life of the street. Sounds coming from loudspeakers pepper the air, a recording selling traditional herbal medicines, a speaker outside a clothing stall playing a gospel song, a man using a bullhorn to call passengers to transit, the amplified recitation of the Iqama overheard as one passes a mosque, the voice of a DJ in a nightclub getting the evening enjoyment started. The amplification of commercial, religious, and secular sounds mingle in the air, blurring these categories of social life together. And so I'm going to play the second sound clip, which is a collage I've made of all these sounds. They're not necessarily, so I've taken them out of their context and remixed them so that we can hear their relationship to each other. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So, and I think by lifting them out this way and remixing them, you hear the street in a way like you take it for granted when you're just moving, but by focusing in, you realize how much this makes up the soundscape of the street. So the anthropologist Brian Larkin has argued that one consequence of loudspeaker culture in Nigerian cities is that, quote, for ordinary Nigerians, urban streets are technologized and everyday life emerges in relation to the machine of the loudspeaker. As Larkin notes, the loudspeaker cultivates a particular ethics of listening, one shaped by both attention and inattention. Sounds broadcast by mosques and churches may be ignored by the pedestrian who just keeps moving, intentionally allowing the sounds to fade into the sonic background. At the same time, one's purposeful walk through the street may be shaped by these amplified sonic interactions, even possibly transformed, interrupted to listen for a moment, to purchase, to take information to come back another time, or to enter and pray, or even to have a transformative spiritual experience. Thus, loudspeaker sounds also contribute to an ethics, one that's ordinary and everyday. At times, they rise up to call the hearer to bring them closer to the source. Other times, they serve to demarcate difference, to create tenuous boundaries between groups who share the streets of the city. At the same time, the loudspeaker culture of the street points to the increasing commodification of religion in Nigeria, as sounding religious publicity through loudspeakers shares oral space with hawkers, traders, touts, and other advertisements, constituting worshipers and non-worshipers as consumers and blurring the distinctions between those social categories. The extent of such audible religious publicity, combined with the experiences of listening to the ambient sounds of commerce mixed with religion in the streets, contributes to the dynamic of religious shopping that is vividly described by Marloes Jansen in her study of religious pluralism in Lagos. Thus, rather than hearing the amplified sounds of religion in the streets of Lagos through a framework of fear of violence, such that Larkin argues for the amplified religious sounds in Kano, in Lagos, instead, such sounds make up part of the religious entrepreneurialism characteristic of the region more generally. So just to briefly conclude, very briefly, so in line with the aims of this panel, which, quote, this is where I'm quoting Bankole's brilliant abstract, which, quote, seeks to reimagine and reconceptualize the street as a phenomenon of existence, of identity, culture, and belonging. The examples I've discussed here suggest quotidian ways in which religious sounds shape the emergence of the street as a site of purpose, sociability, encounter, and ethical formation. Scenes such as those I've discussed here today help to constitute what Otto Kleisen has described as the urban performativity of the street, where different social registers, lived affects, and spatial practices are brought together and made legible. The emergent assemblage of the street via sound also enacts an ethics that both reaffirms and transcends distinctions between the religious and the secular, between commerce and piety, shaping everyday social interactions, contributing to urban sensibilities, and attuning residents towards everyday ethical practices, judgments, and commitments. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. All right, and the final presenter of our two session panel, or two panel sessions.
Yeah.
We're very pleased to have Bankole Wright present his work in progress with us today. So Bankole Wright is a doctoral student of sociocultural anthropology in the Global and Sociocultural Studies program at Florida International University. Wright holds an MA, a BA and MA in English from Lagos State University and from the University of Lagos, respectively. He also obtained another MA in African and African Diaspora Studies from Florida International University. Oh, congratulations, we just got that. Wright's research interests include African urban studies with an emphasis on street life and African popular culture and expressive culture. Bankole Wright serves as a graduate assistant of Lagos Studies, a graduate assistant of the Lagos Studies Association, an international academic. Well, we're here for us.
Yeah.
Please join me in welcoming Bankole Wright.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for coming. And so I decided to, so this is a working idea, and so definitely I've been thinking about streets and street life, but I was fascinated on the 24th of December last year when I heard about the Oshodi Day Carnival. I was fascinated because this is an event, a carnival organized by majorly organized by motor park operators, which we popularly known as Agbero in quotes, right? And these are the people I'm actually working with on my research. And then I picked interest in the event in itself. And from my observation, I must say at first that I have not attended any of the Oshodi Day events because I'm miles away. However, I worked with one of the participants of the Oshodi Day, and who is here. We've been working together, and then she was also part of the pageantry, which is something I'll talk about. So I decided to tinker with an idea which I titled Street Carnivals as Spaces of Becoming. And I would like us to please engage. Thank you. So, yeah, so in African urban imagination and knowledge production, streets and its streeters, that is, those whose identities are connected to and form the streets, have been mostly understood through lenses of violence and precarity. While these perspectives are important in unpacking conditions of survival of the everyday urban ordinary, it is of urgent and utmost importance to understand the place of streets as both physical, symbolic, and embodied manifestations of urban culture as manifested by urban streeters. Specifically, I try to understand street carnivals in Oshodi, Lagos, as spaces where urban streeters express their creative agency, that is, self-representation, as James Yeku, in his chapter titled The Regeneration of Play, Popular Culture as Infra Politics on Instagram, argues. I argue that street carnivals constitute what James Scott calls the Eden script of resistance. However, the question I pose here is what forms this Eden script takes within the context of street carnival, and how does this street carnival shape or turn existing narratives and epistemologies of the street? My argument is that if street carnivals are, in quotes, infra-political from the concept Eden scripts, then they exist in a state of becoming. So basically, my argument is street carnivals are spaces where these urban streeters, that is in quotes, agberos, express their creative agency within political contexts that seemingly reduce them to either political mercenaries or violent actors in that sense. Urban Lagos provides rich insight into urban life in Africa, despite its richness, especially in urban youth and popular culture. Street life, especially from the perspective of those I set out to understand, has been studied minimally. Motor park streeters, popularly known as Agbero, has been predominantly understood for their involvement in state politics, or socioeconomic activities in urban Lagos. I try to understand these urban ordinary, whom I refer to as streeters, as active producers of culture within the popular. Street carnival thus becomes a cultural production through which urban streeters assert agency and self-representation, thus shaping urban street life in Nigeria. So I build on the concept, the Eden script, drawing from James Scott's theory of infopolitics, right? And I read here, it follows that, yeah, can you go to the next slide? Yes, thank you. It follows that the Eden scripts will be least inhibited when two conditions are fulfilled. First, when it is voiced in a sequestered social site where the control, surveillance, and repression of the dominant are least able to reach. And second, when this sequestered social milieu is composed entirely of close confidants who share similar experiences of domination. However, in my work, I imagine the carnival as this sequestered space. Now, how do I think about the carnival as a sequestered space? I think about it basically as that space where the gaze of the state is minimal, and as a form where these people, in quotes, the agberos, are able to do something for themselves within the context of the expressive. To analyze the complex dynamics of street carnivals, my paper employs James Scott's concept of Eden scripts to apprehend how street carnival helps us to understand the self-representation of motopark streeters, that is, agbero. I propose that street carnivals are infrapolitical spaces of becoming. This state of becoming is characterized by subtle, elongated processes of inclusion into urban life's cultural production and epistemologies. The carnival, therefore, becomes an arena where streeters engage in performative acts that simultaneously resist marginalization and seek recognition within the broader fabric, within the broader urban fabric. It is a space of freedom and self-representation. And one of the things that I'm trying to achieve predominantly is trying to include these urban streeters within the context of our understanding of the street, beyond understanding them as just violent and political mercenaries. Because when you check the literature, there is extant work on them as political mercenaries and violence perpetrators. However, they are more than that, right? That is my major argument. And predominantly, that's actually the fulcrum of my work as my doctoral work. Then I move to the analysis. Can we please switch? Yes, okay, so the method. So I relied on interview and visual observation. I observed the YouTube videos uploaded on the event, and then I interviewed participants, of which one of them is here. She's the one taking pictures behind. She was part of the what's it called, the event, and her mom also was part of the community. So I had my I had my data from strongly reliable sources, right? So yes, so I observed two things, right? The first, which I would like to talk about. Can you please? Yes. So I looked at the Ashoebi phenomenon and street spaces. The existence of the Ashoebi in the Oshodide Carnival points to the reality of an associational life, which this idea of association is only limited to in our imagination, or in our ideation of Agbero is only limited to them coming together to cause violent acts and these kinds of things. And I'm saying that these people can also come together within this within the context of fashion and, of course, expressive cultures. And I draw from an anthropologist who argues that the Ashoebi is first and foremost a form of identification and communal ethos with the collective. Ashaibi in Oshodi Day Carnival signifies associational life among urban streeters. Agbero's adoption of the Ashaibi during street carnival signifies active participation in the aesthetic production of street spaces, thereby asserting belonging and shared identity within the urban space. And then I move to the next one, please. Okay, yes, still within that, just for, please go, please. No, I mean, move the previous ones, the Ashaibi. Yes, so this is for your gaze, just to see, right? This year, I mean, last year, it was blue, right? So let's move. By the way, if you intend to attend, it's usually during December. The last one was December 26th. Now, yeah. Now I move to the next one. Oshodi Day as a space of self-representation, pageantry, and the gendering of streets. I think yeah. So I looked at some very important issues within the context of, within the context of the pageantry, right? So we have one of the events in the Oshodi Day is a pageant, what's it called? Showcase in that sense. However, of which she was part of them, right? She was part of this. Now, what does this pageantry help us to achieve within this context, this streets context? First, visibility and recognition. Through spectacular displays, female streeters claim public space, demand attention and recognition from both their immediate community and the broader urban society. So here, they help, you are seeing them and you're helping them to, and one of the things she told me was, females from Oshodi are usually seen as violent as well, and also, in quotes, lady of easy virtue. So one of the things that this pageantry intends to achieve is to showcase women in their beauty, to showcase them and to help them to see them beyond how they have been hitherto viewed within the context of the space where they exist. Moving on, identity negotiation, which is something I've also talked about. So the carnival provides a space for experimenting with and performing various identities, allowing participants to explore different aspects of their urban selves. For instance, the pageantry was one aspect, right? And then, of course, cultural synthesis. By blending traditional and contemporary elements, which is something we see. The Ankara is a traditional, right, within a contemporary context, right? Carnival participants present themselves as bearers of a dynamic and evolving urban culture. So I'll conclude here, please move. Yes, in conclusion, right? Yes, in conclusion, street carnivals in Oshodi serve as spaces of becoming. And I think I should speak more on why I use the word becoming, right? So I use the word becoming because, first, this gaze is not going to, like the previous understanding of, in quote, Agbero and females that emerge from that space you will only be inspired now. But I use the word becoming as a continuous thing. So I'm challenging scholars to begin to look at these people, these streeters, beyond these previous narratives. Hence, their identities is in a consistent flux of becoming. That was why I chose the word becoming. So there is a continuous representation and re-representation of these people within the space. Yes, this event constitutes hidden script of resistance. Now, I relied on, of course, I chose James Scott's hidden script of resistance only because I want to argue that the idea of resistance is not just about domination, that maybe very clear-cut domination, but also academic and intellectual domination. I'm looking at them, this pageantry, for instance, and the Oshodi Day as a whole is a hidden script of resistance because it function, and one of the things that I want to prove also is that when I checked Google Scholar and I just Googled Oshodi Day, I couldn't find anything on Oshodi Day. And that says a lot, right? So these are the kinds of resistance that my work intends to push. And the pageantry, I am the one positioning the pageantry as one hidden script of resistance in that sense. So the street carnival provides such sequestered social milieu, allowing Agberos to express their shared experience and challenge dominant narratives. By recognizing street carnivals as spaces of becoming, we can appreciate the complex ways urban streeters shape and redefine the epistemologies of street life in African cities. Thank you. One more slide. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge. So I got screenshots online, and then she provided pictures. So please, I want to acknowledge my participants.
Thank you so much, Bankole, for this wonderful presentation. Okay, so we have tons of time, amazingly. What?
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
When I finish. So what I was going to say is that we have tons of time. I'm happy to welcome questions for the entire panel all together on our topic that we have in common, but also for individual panelists. Please, when you ask your question, tell us who you are and keep it brief so we can get more questions. So I'll collect a few at a time. I guess, are tech people allowed to ask questions? I'm kidding. We get the first question. Introduce yourself.
Good afternoon.
Yes.
My name is Ashima Kapo. We're currently students in the University of Mississippi. And I'm working with the industry aspects. So while listening, like this presentation stood out to me because I see, especially Professor
Brennan.
So I can see Lagos beyond West, Lagos beyond text, literal text. Now I'm seeing Lagos in the South. I'm seeing the landscape analysis, soundscape analysis of Lagos. And your work is so interesting to me because I work on films. And then right now I'm seeing the audio aspect of the image, right? How Lagos makes sense to someone who is in the diaspora. People don't have to read Lagos, but just by listening to this sound, this is me.
Right.
So that's something that we used to do that for me. And I'm wondering, what are the challenges faced why don't you considering the fact that you're exploring that. And then coming to Bankole, the issue of street art, I want to know what is the street art? What next one is street art? If I living on the streets, if I walking in the streets, if I engaging with activities in the streets, what next to the street art? What the price of what's in the street art? And is that a stigma that is attached to street art or street life? And then talking about pageantry, when I was an undergraduate, I was also into pageantry. I was on contest on that, so I was on stage. So, and pageantry is beyond, looking at these awareness beyond what people call them as people practicing part of what possible visions in communities. And I'm looking at awareness and engagement. I'm looking at awareness and how they contribute to the able to get labels to that civil rights. And I'm looking at pageantry is beyond. Now we're talking about wrestling because I know when I was into pageantry, women come out to wear bikinis and being regarded as prostitutes, right? And display images. But that is beyond that. Some of these girls child have stretch marks, have stretch marks, right? And most many of them has been told, oh, you're not beautiful because of the stretch marks, your tribal marks is not beautiful. So pageantry is also a way for them to come out to express themselves, regardless of whatever marks you have on your body. Be yourself and come out and express yourself. So that's very important. You are walking on the street of Lagos, trying to see the Lagos of the 1890s. And I came to wonder, how do we have sort of how film making can help to bring the old Lagos, the streets, the old Lagos streets, basically in currently, but as every day, how we reflect the everyday life of students, of student life in places.
Thank you, sir, for your excellent questions. We'll collect some more. Did you have a question? Yes.
Fantastic presentation.
Who are you?
My name is Igwe. I'm a research fellow at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. So very quickly, I'll be very brief. I don't know if I should say the question or an session on what you're doing. But coming from you, I spent a lot of time in Lagos Island in this side. Now, some of the buildings in Lagos Island, for example, Outer Marina Broad Street, you see a building for speakers, Central Bank now Bank civilization. Now, that particular undergraduate, that was my research center. So, Back, the building itself is a colonial relic, a colonial heritage. Used to be the head office of the colonial government back then in Lagos. But now, the change of names in Lagos streets is a problem. So I want to know clearly now, you can retain the names of the streets in Lagos, but the name is government compliant to question. That's very important. Yeah, so it's about socially fantastic, but then I think not just socially, you probably have what you call the modern speak. Now, our major markets in Lagos are having this cultural advantage. It's more than during the same period, December time is a festive era. So there are everybody have their Ankara. Of course, single mode with the is the most popular. I don't think the popular with that in Lagos. But then we have the organic ones that also fully represented galvanizing people to support contact. Everything that was so emotionally was repeated with contacts and I was this part.
Thank you very much. Yes, if the red cap, please.
Thank you very much. So very particular.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I know you. But I got you.
I think we have not this so I will put question for the right. But we also to imagine become something context of able to find that without mastering so that also the case. Actually, last one lies in December, I think so it's pointed impossible to write behind cover of side, it's just the same and the second of that. Associated with Canva, balance. It's not about opportunity to share schools. Like we this build conscious. If you want to speak it's not just your pillar. I also attended one in Thailand. It was a period between a year and a year. It's probably little engage this so you need also need this good here what has been not be successful when it's not or so far opportunity
Thank you. So we'll answer these questions and we'll come back for the next round. We also have one question online. Professor Halimat, can you speak? Can you ask your question? We have to promote her. Halimat Sholosoha.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good morning. Sorry, it's morning here. But anyway, this was really great. I learned so much from everyone. And there's a really interesting, sort of like this really interesting ties in terms of the ways in which like music and festival and history kind of comes together. I have a question for everyone, and please indulge me. And I think this is because, the conversation and the papers are so rich. I'm going to start with Vicky. And I'm an historian of 20th century Lagos, by the way. So because I'm coming from the discipline of history, I think this informs the question that I'm about to ask. Because as you were speaking, I was thinking about, how do you situate this phenomena within a longer historical context? In terms of the ways in which, and I think, Ademide's work really sort of helps me to sort of bring this together. Where in terms of we were thinking about this historically in different part of Lagos, how can you connect the musical sites and, the places, musical sites in this case, churches, mosques, it's not just actually in the physical side of the street, but also how does this sort of filter and engage with what's happening beyond it? And how can you map it out? And again, I'm, drawing from Ademide here, within specific spaces and sites within the city. So that's my question in terms of just like, what does this look like? How can we imagine this within a longer historical context? And my second question is for Bankole. This is really, really fascinating, and I'm really sort of looking forward to reading more about this. Part of my work focuses on Ekpatedo, so I think a lot about the history of that place. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about, there is something interesting about looking specifically at this event, in terms of Oshodi Day, and thinking about Oshodi itself as a residential area and the differences between that as well as how it's like a transit place, right? So how do you bring those two together when you're thinking about the agency of the people who are participating in this event? And I think it's interesting that you are making use of James Scott and also trying to think about how do you complicate the lives of these people beyond what the literature, how the categories that the literature has placed on them, which is, as you rightly said, it's either violence or people who are being used for political work. But then I was thinking about when you actually follow and understand the lives of these people, whether or not, I don't know if some of them, the people who participate in this event, so who are the people that actually live in Oshodi and claim to be from Oshodi? And who are the people who are actually attending the events because, they just want to be part of this festival? Because as you know, festivals have a long history in Lagos. And then I was thinking about, if let's say we don't think about them within the two categories of violent thugs and, political sort of actors, and we just sort of understand their lives solely on its own terms, what are the new ways, what are the new insights that we can get? And how is it that I can understand you're trying to move beyond the paradigm, but to what extent are you also resituating those paradigms of, violence or targeting the narrative when you're constantly centering that versus like trying to understand what this pageantry really mean within the context of what it means to be from Oshodi or what it means to sort of like celebrate, that cause that day. That's just my own thought about that. But, really looking forward to more research on this as well as what you have to say. Or maybe you can also tell us a little bit about what this means within the course of your research much more broadly. And I think that would be very illuminating. And for Ademide, I've been thinking about this, the names of some of the streets from Ekpatedo, and I think again you and Bankole have a really interesting resonance here in terms of Oshodi's relationship to Ekpatedo. One of the things I was thinking about is, because I haven't done this myself, so this might be a really interesting opportunity. It's because some of the people who are from Ekpatedo, they have connections to North Central Nigeria in terms of their Nukwe origin. So I'm wondering, have you thought about or looked at the Nukwe names to see what they means and how they can sort of connect to some of the names that you are looking at from Ekpatedo specifically? Because when I've heard Inabere or Inabere in this, I people tend to say Inabere rather than Inabere. And in the case of Inasa too, it's usually pronounced as Inasa rather than Inasa, which Inasa means, as you said, fire started here. Inasa, I don't know what it means, but at least that's how I've heard it being pronounced. So I was thinking that maybe one way to kind of like expand on the names of these places is by also like tracing them back to North Central Nigeria, in this case, Nukwe land, and seeing what they mean back there. But thank you very much. This was all very rich.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your question. So we'll answer quickly, then we'll take another set of questions. Vicky, do you want to?
Sure.
I think she should come.
Okay. So
maybe we'll keep it to like 2-3 minutes.
yeah, I'll try to be brief. So thanks for your questions. I'll just note, you noted how this presentation made you think about the way Lagos sounds in a distinct way. And Emeka Ogbo, the sound artist, he's a multimedia artist. he's done some really great work. He had an installation in Berlin where he brought a Danfo bus and then had the soundscape playing. And people like Nigerian immigrants, they were describing like they're hearing Lagos, but they're on the streets of Berlin and, you know, like being drawn to that place. But you also asked about the challenges I faced. And I think, well, the main challenge I faced for this is a preliminary research that I'd started that I'd like to do long term. And the initial challenge was COVID, that I really couldn't be here. The second challenge was I had to train the research assistants to pay attention to the sounds because they took them for granted. So we had a 3-day training where we just listened, and I made them, they didn't want to write as much as I wanted them to write, that's for sure, but really describe their evocative experiences of being in that space and what did they hear and how did it make them feel, and to reflect on like, what do they think about sound in Lagos more generally. So the challenges, I guess, I mean, but ultimately, I wanted to be on the street. I think it actually was better I wasn't there because I stick out, you know, on the streets of Lagos, and they were able to just flow freely with people, and you know, they weren't really allowed to interact because I wanted to maintain a kind of sort of ethical anonymity. So I told them not to talk to anybody unless they were spoken to. But to just really hear how they heard the city from their perspective, and to really map it out. So the question about how to situate it in historical context is a great question. So one of the things I would really love to do as part of this project is look into the archives. Like, how were colonial officials describing the sounds of the street? How were the noise ordinances created? And then how can you read those against the grain to think about, like, how were everyday Lagosians actually sounding in the streets that Ademide is like mapping out for us so well, right? So I think there's probably some record in the colonial archives that we can both use, but also, you know, read against or brush against them. And I think that would be a really amazing way to situate it historically, but also for me, like, you know, I'm now becoming a senior professor, I guess. And you know, so this I see as one of my last big projects, but I would like it to be over the longer term. So to do maybe a 5 to 10-year project where we just keep listening to the city and listening to how it changes over that time. So like, yeah, help me, pray that I get the funding. Or if anybody wants to be involved, we can do collaborative funding, but I would love to do more with this, so thank you.
So just to answer very quickly, thank you for the question from Able Stuff. As a filmmaker, of course, you know how difficult it is to be in Lagos Island. You know how the contemporary city seems overwhelming. But this is where historical research becomes really important, because even myself, in doing this work, I thought it was impossible at first. I did a project on trying to find the historical tram from the early 20th century. And it turns out there is evidence of old things all over Lagos Island, even though people are constantly trying to erase it. If you know what you're looking at, if you've done the research, if you have the sources, there are things all over Lagos. It doesn't have to be just Government House. It doesn't have to be just the streets. There's evidence of the city, the old city all around, and this is part of what I do. So as Dr. Brennan said, collaboration was so important, and this is why we're here in Lagos Study. These are not questions for one person, right, that they can answer. So absolutely, there's a visual element of the history of the city that's available. And I think part of, rather than trying to isolate it, you should think about how it's changed over time, and we can talk about that. Also, the street names, one of the things that's exciting about the street names is that they reflect change over time. So some names have endured. I mean, Marina used to, well, some names have changed, but some have endured. Marina used to be Water Street. Broad Street has always been Broad Street. Inobere or Inobere, whatever you call it, has always been that. Omididu has always been that. When things disappear, like Isalagogo Lagoon or the Isalagogo Bridge, those names still remain and they mark this space and time. So I think what you also have to understand is the relationship. And then as we get new governors, new people who are important, more names are added. And as more streets are built, more names are added. So this is something that's also quite complex and it changes over time. It's never been static. And in fact, for me, one of the most exciting things in looking at street names is sometimes in some parts of Lagos Island, you see the old name, the new name, and the name that's maybe coming. So you see all the labels on a house. And I think that historical layering is so fascinating. So I'll be happy to share pictures if you want to see. And Professor Halimat, great question. I didn't do a lot of etymological work outside of Benin
outside of names influenced by Benin or Yoruba. So, but I think that's a great point, because a lot of times there's confusion about what names mean now and how they were pronounced or how they were recorded. So there's a lot of, I guess there's a lot of clashing information about how we use things today and how they were used and how some British official wrote what he thought he was hearing, you know, or she was hearing. So, Bankole.
All right, thank you so much. So I think I'll start by saying that I am not undermining scholarship and the existence of violence within these spaces, not at all. In fact, what I'm trying to do is to see how we can understand them in multifaceted ways, right? Of which this work happens to be one of them, right? So violence is, while I think about violence in different spaces, right? And you settle scores in different spaces, even within intellectual spaces, right? But the forms may just differ, right? Also, when we say, and I really am grateful to Professor Shomoton, who said recentering violence, right? Because even the idea of violence, we have to rethink it. Within what context do we see the violence? Because in popular spaces, in what's it called, in social media, I just Googled Agbero on social media, and the stuff that I saw, they are not, and now, once again, I'm not saying that they are wrong. I'm not saying that they are not true. I'm saying that they're the most dominant. That's what I'm saying, right? And it's important that as researchers, we should balance the scripts, we should balance the perspectives, right? And we should also be able to see how we can understand these people within broader perspectives. So, and I agree that, in fact, I think it was this morning that I was just thinking, I was like, I think when I continue with this work, the first thing I have to do is to look at the historical context. And yeah, there's something very interesting. So when I was talking to the participants, right, and she said that in Oshodi, as far as she knows, one of the historical antecedents, or one of the reasons why this carnival emerged, was as a result of the violence from one street to another, where a street in Oshodi is fighting with another street in Oshodi. And then they had to invent ways of coming together and communal living and communities. So these are ways to recenter and rethink violence in that sense. How something as expressive as this can emerge from the context of violence, right? So these are some of the things that also inform it. So the historical perspective is also something that I really agree with. Now, the question of who is a streeter is something I am still thinking theoretically and conceptually. However, my provisional definition, right, was basically, yeah. And I said it when I started. I said, street and its streeters, that is, those whose identities are connected, and I'll add to it, are created as well, to, in, and from the streets. Now, please note me, provisional, because I'm still thinking about it, right? It's not cast in stone, right? It's tentative. So I'm still thinking about it. And the more I study these streeters, the more I intend to understand them from their perspective. So I need to, of course, I'm going to do more field work, collect more data, and from there, I can begin to theorize and conceptualize the idea of who a streeter is from their own stories and from their own experiences. And what else? Oh yes, within the context of my broad research. So I'm particularly interested in the cultural production of the streets, right? And the motor park urban workers, right, happen to be one aspect or one group of people and individuals that constitute my broader work. So they are not the only ones, right? But they are, right now, they are the major, what's it called, community that I'm working with for my dissertation. And Yes.
So I'll collect.
Have
more.
I?
Okay.
Okay. Yes.
So just a note on the timing. We started a few minutes late and we've been generously promised an extra 5 minutes. So if you do have to leave at 12:30, that's fine. But we will continue until 12:35. So I will collect questions from here and one from online. Yes, in front, please.
Thank you.
Don't forget to introduce yourself.
My name is Mary. I'm student of Lagos State University. I'm a unique student. I can now see another perspective of sound. Now, this data you've collected, can it also be online that someone can also use? Because I love what you've done and also use it to also, is it possible? Then to Bankole. Is it Bankole? Yes, Bankole. Yes, I also wrote something on streetism, on children, relating it with music. I was interrogated also, saying I should define streetism. So I also defined. Now, my question is, you only use Agberoad for that carnival. I also live in a street whereby they also do carnivals every year at that time. But these people are not, this carnival are not organized by the Agberoads. Yes, Agberoads also live on the street. They live in that street and they go out to the road to make money and live their kind of violent life and coming. So they participate in that street. So are you actually using streets as a are you using your research on just street or using the Agberoads as a subject to read to define your streeting? The street as so that
Yes.
Yeah,
The shorter we are, the more we get.
short question. One of the major things that comes to mind when you talk about politics of
your name,
ownership. I've done this over and over again. My name is Joseph Kunuji. Yeah. So it's the politics of ownership for me. And I would like to know, Ademide, how your work speaks to that without necessarily trying to resolve the tensions. Then to talking about the soundscape, I know that the time that you collect your data determines what you get. Like morning, afternoon, even midnight, you hear different things. So within the broader framework of Lagos soundscape as identity marker, what can you say, or how would you describe the different time? How would you frame it to indicate the difference in your data?
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Chino. I work at Brown University. Also, okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chilo Alagola Kubi Black. I work at Communication Arts Department, Brown University, also a graduate student, doing my doctoral studies at Harvard University. So I have a question for Professor V. Those are the two sessions I met, and Bankole as well. Fantastic presentation. I think I saw Lagos from a different perspective, despite spending all my life in Lagos. Okay, volume. Okay, you can hear me. Wow. Can you stand? Okay, all right. Okay, so let me stand. Okay, is this better? Can everyone hear me? Okay, so sorry. You got my name right? I don't have to introduce them. Okay, so I was starting with Professor V, and I said that despite spending almost all my life in Lagos, I got a different perspective of Lagos, and I think at the point where you played some of the audios, right? Almost everyone here, we had some similar, you brought us back to that reality and all. And so my question is, first of all, before I go to my question, I think it was very interesting what you did with urban technology and the loudspeaker. I saw the loudspeaker from a different perspective. I saw it from a religious point, wherein both the Christians and the Muslim, we use it. We hear that Allahu Akbar, 5 a.m. We hear all of that from that different. I also saw it from an economic standpoint, wherein people use it to sell goods. You hear almost that repetitive voice coming in, drawing your attention to their shops, or whatever it is. And then I saw that cultural identity. I saw the cultural identity from there. So my question now is, why the choice? What's the rationale behind Surulere? Idumota, I understand Idumota, that's the
that's probably where Lagos begins and ends, but then why the choice of Sule? And then briefly for Bankole, I'm not going to go, he's already touched on the violent part of things, but I want to say from the pageantry, what was the standard that was used to for these women? What was one? What did they wear? Maybe what was the standard? We know how they look. We have a perspective of how they currently look. So was that change? Was that narrative change at the pageantry, or it was the same thing and it was just amplified?
Mary, okay.
Online. Okay.
You've been unmuted.
You've been unmuted. Can you please speak? Okay, so we're gonna have to skip you. We're running out of time. In the far corner, please. Yes, quickly, so we can get more.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
Yes, we
Hello?
can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay.
Go ahead and speak to us. Yes, sir.
Okay, my name is Nat Ogunyale. My question is to the chair, Mrs. Adeluyi. And it has to do with our presentation, which is quite interesting and very educative. But my question is, what are you going to do? What are you going to do to improve this research work as regards the problem we are having, we historians? I am an art historian. The problem we are currently having with our European historian that gives us history that are Eurocentric, that are few from their own perspective, instead of going down to the people who are concerned. And I'm asking this question because when you are mentioning names, for example, you mentioned Ojutiku, Tijuiku, Inobere, I got confused because what's the difference between Inobere and Inobere? There is the proper way of pronouncing that name. And Tijuiku is not literally you are shy of die, or no. There is historical factor behind that name. And I want to suggest that as an historian, you should go down to the roots. One of the ways you can get this information is to get the appropriate pronunciation and the meaning behind it. And you can't get it from abroad. You have to come to the people. There are elderly people around those areas that can tell you more about the historical antecedent of those names, the origin, and what have you. So I'm asking, what are you doing? What are you going to do to improve on that?
Don't worry. Thank you for your question. So 3 more in the corner. Yes.
Okay, my name is Chioma Regina Waduka. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm interested in your part of the work. You see, he's by Dr. Bankole.
Okay, don't support her. Okay.
Okay, so I grew up in Lagos. I'm from the East, Chioma. Now, I'm interested in intervention. I would, from my perspective, believe that these people are psychopathological. In quotes, that's what we believe. They are deviants. They've been exposed to very negative lifestyle. Now, this research is good, but what interventions do you intend to do? How do we offer alternatives or present better lifestyle? If they can be this good with the pageantry, with the Oshodi, is there a way we can intervene to make them better? Thank you.
So much.
All right. I'm Judge Elizabeth Anthony. I'd like to suggest to Bankole precisely appreciate everything. So let me not talk much. Since you're working on the streeters and whatever, and you mentioned Carnival, I'm from Calabar. I want to suggest to you that you can borrow an idea, maybe by touring down to Cross River State, Calabar, to watch our carnival there, so you can be able to bring in ideas and sell to the people, since you'll be doing suggestions to them. So it's an invitation for you to come to Calabar. Welcome.
Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Odali. I'm an African philosopher affiliated to Anambra State University, Ibadan. And beyond academic research, I love to express knowledge and get more about knowledge through my story writing and spoken word artist. So I'm looking at this from my interest in personhood and identity. When you talk about becoming Bankole, who are they? Because when we talk about becoming, there's an identity. Who are they? What are they going on to become? That's what I want to really get. Thank you.
Thank you for the great presentations. My name is Paul Ugo. I am a professor at the University of Waterloo in Canada. I don't have a question. It's just a comment for Bankole. I see the temptation to resistance and agency have become buzzwords in cultural studies, and everyone wants to use it. But it seems to me that much of what you're doing, if you think of subversion, it would work more. So think about the concept of subversion rather than resistance and agency. Maybe it will become a much more helpful concept. Thank you.
I want to encourage you, if you have more questions, please follow up with everybody on the panels. Our emails are here. I want to thank all of you for engaging with us on this panel and the other one. I want to thank my co-panelists. I want to thank our able tech backup for not just being good at the technology, but also being brilliant scholars in your own mind. And of course, many special thank you to Bankole for creating